There are moments in your life that act as foundations, stones laid so quietly you don't notice their significance until you try to build something on top of them. They are the silent truths you carry, the architecture of your own heart. For years, my foundation was a simple, unshakable fact. I loved Liam Hale. It was a truth as constant and as unnoticed as the pull of gravity, a law of my own small universe. And then there are moments that are not foundations, but earthquakes. They are the ones that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday night on a worn-out sofa, and proceed to fracture everything you thought you knew, shaking those quiet stones until the entire structure of your world threatens to collapse. This was one of those moments, an earthquake in the form of a sleeping man, his head resting heavily in the crook of my shoulder, his breathing a slow, warm tide against my neck. He had fallen asleep during the third act of some forgettable action movie, the kind he always chose, full of explosions and quippy one-liners that were meant to distract from the hollowness of the plot. The television was still murmuring, casting flickering blue and orange light across the room, painting fleeting, dramatic shadows on his face. My arm, trapped beneath him, had gone numb an hour ago, a constellation of pins and needles that I refused to disturb. Every instinct screamed at me to shift, to alleviate the discomfort, but a stronger, more primal part of my brain had seized control. It was a part of me that had been starved for this exact proximity, for this specific weight, for years. It was a part that would have gladly let my arm wither and fall off if it meant another 5 minutes of this impossible peace. He smelled of the crisp night air, a hint of the soap from my shower, and something that was uniquely him, a scent like clean laundry and distant thunderstorms that I had long ago cataloged and stored in the most protected vault of my memory. This was the ritual we had fallen into over the past 3 months, ever since his world had been upended. It was a fragile, unspoken agreement forged in the crucible of his heartbreak. His long-term relationship with Sarah had imploded in a way that was both spectacular and devastatingly common, and in the aftermath, he had drifted, an untethered ship in a storm. My apartment became his lighthouse, his safe harbor. It started with late-night phone calls, then morphed into him showing up on my doorstep, looking lost and hollowed out. It wasn't long before he was spending more nights on my couch than in his own empty apartment, a space that he said still echoed with her absence. And I, the quiet observer, the steadfast friend, let him. I opened my door and my life to him without a second thought, because that is what friends do. And because, if I was being honest with myself in the silent, lonely hours before dawn, I was incapable of doing anything else. My love for him was an old photograph, developed in the darkroom of my adolescence and kept carefully hidden away. We had met in college, 2 swimmers on the university team who couldn't have been more different. He was the sun, a supernova of easy charm and effortless talent, drawing people into his orbit with a gravitational pull he seemed entirely unaware of. He moved through the world with a casual grace, a confidence that I could only ever dream of emulating. I, on the other hand, was a creature of the shadows, more comfortable beneath the distorted, silent world of the water than on the loud, chaotic pool deck. I was a photographer, even then, always watching, always framing the world through an invisible lens, cataloging expressions, gestures, the subtle shifts of light and mood. I was good in the water, a reliable anchor for the relay team, but on land, I felt clumsy, my words always a few beats behind my thoughts. Liam had never seemed to notice. He'd crashed into my quiet life with the force of a tidal wave, pulling me into his circle of friends, making me feel seen in a way I never had before. He saw my quietness not as a flaw, but as a point of interest. He'd peer over my shoulder while I edited photos, not with the polite disinterest of others, but with genuine curiosity. He'd ask about f-stops and shutter speeds, about why I chose to capture one moment and not another. He learned to read my moods in the set of my shoulders or the slight downturn of my mouth, responding with a gentle joke or a comforting hand on my back. Our friendship was built in the chlorinated quiet of early morning practices, in the shared exhaustion after a difficult meet, in long drives to away games with the radio playing softly between us. It was the most significant relationship of my life, and for him, I was a cherished fixture, his constant, his Julian, the safe place. And I had learned, over the years, to be content with that. I had packed my feelings for him into a sturdy, locked box and buried it deep within myself. I dated other people, had relationships that were perfectly fine, but they always felt like they were printed on a different kind of paper, a thinner stock that lacked the weight and texture of what I felt for Liam. I watched him fall in love with Sarah, a bright, bubbly woman who seemed to match his energy perfectly. I was the best man at their hypothetical wedding we planned one drunken night, the godfather to their imaginary golden retriever. I played my part so well that I sometimes even convinced myself I was his best friend. That was my role, the foundation I had built my adult life upon. It was a stable, if lonely, existence. But her leaving had sent a tremor through that foundation. It had created a crack, and through that crack, something new and terrifyingly hopeful began to seep in. In his grief, Liam had turned to me, and the carefully constructed boundaries I had maintained for a decade began to dissolve, night by night, on this very couch. At first, he would just talk for hours, circling the same painful memories, trying to understand where it all went wrong. I would just listen, making him tea, offering a quiet presence that asked for nothing in return. I became an expert in the geography of his sorrow, mapping the coastlines of his anger and the deep, abyssal trenches of his regret. I learned the exact moment his voice would crack, the way he'd rub the back of his neck when he was fighting back tears. I watched him dismantle himself, piece by painful piece, and I simply stayed, a silent witness to his unraveling. Then came the exhaustion. The talking would taper off, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. He would stare at the television, not really seeing it, his body thrumming with a restless, anxious energy. One night, about a month into this new routine, he had stretched out on the couch, his feet near my end. "Is this okay?" he had asked, his voice rough with fatigue. I had simply nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was the first breach of the physical barrier, a casual intimacy that felt anything but casual to me. His socked feet were inches from my thigh, a proximity that felt both seismic and perfectly natural. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a magnetic pull that I had to consciously resist. That night, I sat ramrod straight for 2 hours, every nerve ending alight, until his breathing evened out and I knew he was asleep. From there, the progression was a slow, creeping tide. His feet touching my leg became a regular occurrence. Then, one night, he shifted, muttering something in his sleep, and laid his head on my lap. I froze, my entire body locking up. It was a purely unconscious act on his part, a search for comfort in the depths of sleep. But for me, it was a moment of profound, terrifying clarity. His hair was soft against the rough denim of my jeans. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his pulse through the fabric. I remember looking down at him, his face peaceful in sleep, the lines of stress around his eyes momentarily smoothed away, and feeling a wave of such overwhelming tenderness that it almost brought me to tears. I wanted to reach out, to smooth the hair back from his forehead, but I didn't dare. I was a statue, a monument to unspoken feelings, letting him sleep, letting him find a moment of peace at my expense. Or perhaps, for my benefit. This current arrangement, him asleep on my shoulder, was the latest evolution of our ritual. It had happened for the first time last week. We had been sitting closer than usual, sharing a blanket against the autumn chill that had begun to creep into the city. He had simply leaned his head against me, a weary, boneless slump that signaled complete surrender to his exhaustion. There was no pretext this time, no accidental shifting in his sleep. It was a conscious choice. He had chosen me as his pillow, his anchor, and my body had betrayed me, a shiver running through me that I prayed he mistook for a chill. He hadn't seemed to notice. He had just sighed, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to carry all the weight of the past few months with it, and closed his eyes. Now, looking at him in the flickering light of the television, I felt a dangerous hope unfurling in my chest, a delicate, green shoot pushing its way through the compacted soil of my resignation. Every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings. He's grieving. He's lonely. He's just seeking comfort from his closest friend. This doesn't mean what you want it to mean. Don't mistake a desperate need for sanctuary for a deliberate act of love. To him, this couch was just a couch, and I was just Julian. A safe space. A piece of furniture, almost. Reliable. Sturdy. Uncomplicated. He wasn't seeing the intricate web of feelings I was caught in, the years of carefully suppressed longing that made a simple touch feel like an electric shock. He couldn't know that for me, this couch had become a sacred space, an altar where I worshipped the ghost of a possibility. His hand, which had been resting on his own chest, twitched in his sleep and then slid down, his fingers brushing against my thigh. The contact was feather-light, barely there, but it sent a jolt straight through me. I held my breath, my gaze fixed on his hand. His fingers were long and graceful, a swimmer's hands, strong and capable. I had watched those hands cut through the water, pull him through life with an easy confidence. Now, they rested against me with a kind of innocent intimacy that was undoing me. I had a sudden, vivid memory of being 17, watching him from across the pool, laughing with some girl, and feeling that familiar, hopeless ache in my chest. I had spent more than a decade perfecting the art of wanting him from a safe distance. This new proximity was a language I didn't know how to speak. It felt like trying to read a beautiful, complex poem in a language I had never been taught, catching only a word or a phrase here and there, terrified of misinterpreting the entire meaning. A car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a brief second, his face was thrown into sharp relief. I could see the tiny scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident, the faint stubble along his jaw, the way his eyelashes fanned out against his cheek. My photographers, I took it all in, composing the shot, memorizing the details. The quiet intimacy of it all was breathtaking. This was a side of him I was sure even Sarah hadn't seen very often, the completely unguarded, vulnerable stillness of deep sleep. He trusted me this much. He felt safe enough with me to let go completely. The thought was both a comfort and a torment. It was the foundation of our friendship, the very thing I cherished most, and also the wall that stood between what we were and what I so desperately wanted us to be. He shifted again, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and burrowed his face more deeply into my shoulder. His breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought he was waking up. My heart seized in a panic. I wasn't ready to have this moment broken, to have to invent a casual excuse for why we were sitting like this, to see the moment of realization, or worse, revulsion, in his eyes. But he just settled back in his sleep, his body relaxing against mine even more completely. The tension drained out of me, leaving behind a profound ache. It was the ache of a love that had nowhere to go, a silent, patient thing that had lived inside me for so long it had become a part of my anatomy, like a phantom limb that I could always feel but never use. I knew this couldn't last. This strange, liminal space we were occupying, somewhere between friendship and something more, was not sustainable. It was a bubble, beautiful and iridescent, but destined to pop. Sooner or later, he would start to heal. He would start going out again, meeting new people. He would eventually fall in love again. The thought sent a cold dread washing over me. He would move on, and I would be left here, on this couch, with the ghost of his warmth and the memory of his weight against me. I would go back to being just Julian, the reliable friend, the safe harbor he no longer needed. And this interlude, this beautiful, painful, hopeful period, would become just another photograph I kept hidden away, a secret memory to be taken out and examined in the lonely quiet of the night. But for now, in the blue-hued darkness of my living room, with the low murmur of the television as our soundtrack, I allowed myself to pretend. I pretended this was not a byproduct of his grief, but a choice. I pretended the weight of his head on my shoulder was a declaration, not a convenience. I allowed the dangerous, fragile hope to bloom, to fill my chest until it was hard to breathe. I closed my eyes, leaning my own head back against the cushion, and just focused on the sensation of his breathing, the slow, steady rhythm that was a counterpoint to the frantic, chaotic drumming of my own heart. I held on to the moment, trying to burn it into my memory, trying to capture every detail, every sensation. Because I knew, with a certainty that was as deep and painful as my love for him, that moments like this were all I might ever have, and I would have to learn to be grateful for them, even if they were destined to break my heart. This ritual, our unspoken covenant of the couch, continued for weeks, becoming the new architecture of our evenings. He would arrive with takeout, his shoulders slumped from a long day of coding, and we would eat in a comfortable silence punctuated by the clinking of forks and the low hum of the city outside my window. He stopped talking about Sarah as much. The raw, open wound of his grief was beginning to scar over, leaving behind a quieter, more pervasive melancholy. Our conversations shifted, becoming less about the past and more about the strange, untethered present. We talked about his work, about my latest photography project, about movies and books and the quiet absurdities of daily life. It was easy. It was the way we had always been. But now there was this new layer, this physical dimension that hummed with unspoken tension beneath the surface of our familiar rapport. I became a scholar of his physical language, an obsessive analyst of every casual touch. I learned that when he was truly exhausted, he would let his knee press against mine for the entire length of a movie. I learned that when a scene was particularly funny, his laughter would make his whole body shake against me. I learned that when he was feeling anxious, his fingers would drum a restless pattern on the cushion, sometimes just an inch from my hand. Each of these small gestures was a clue, a breadcrumb that I would gather and examine late at night, trying to assemble them into a map that might lead me to the truth. Was this just the casual affection of a friendship that had weathered a storm, or was it the tentative exploration of a new territory? I was terrified of asking, terrified of giving a name to what was happening between us, because naming it would force a choice. And I was afraid that his choice would not be me. One Thursday night, the first real cold snap of the season hit. A bitter wind rattled the window panes, and a light, icy rain slicked the streets below. Liam showed up looking more depleted than I had seen him in a while. A big project at work had hit a snag, and he had been pulling 14-hour days trying to fix it. He barely touched his food, his eyes dark with fatigue. He collapsed onto the couch and was asleep within minutes, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder. But this time was different. An hour later, he began to shiver in his sleep, his body trembling with a deep, bone-rattling chill. He had only been wearing a thin t-shirt, not nearly enough for the damp cold that had seeped into the apartment. Without thinking, I reached for the thick woolen blanket I kept folded on the back of the armchair. Gently, moving with a slowness I usually reserved for developing delicate film, I draped it over him. My movements were careful, measured, trying not to wake him. As I tucked the blanket around his shoulders, my fingers brushed against the back of his neck. His skin was cool to the touch. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a tremor through my own body. He mumbled something incoherent, a soft, sleepy sound, and then, still fast asleep, he turned towards me, shifting his body so that he was curled against my side, his arm draping loosely across my stomach. My breath caught in my throat. This was a new development, a significant escalation. Before, our contact had been mostly incidental, a leaning of heads, a brushing of knees. This was an embrace, a one-sided, unconscious embrace, but an embrace nonetheless. His face was now tucked into the curve of my neck and shoulder, his warm breath ghosting across my skin. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against my ribs, a slow, powerful rhythm that seemed to be trying to synchronize with my own frantic pulse. The scent of him was overwhelming, intoxicating. I was completely encased in his presence, his warmth seeping through my clothes, chasing away the chill of the room. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle tensed, my mind racing. This was crossing a line. This was a level of intimacy that friends, even best friends, didn't typically share. The plausible deniability that had been my shield was growing thinner with every passing moment. He was asleep. He didn't know what he was doing. I could tell myself that 1,000 times, but it didn't change the reality of his arm around me, of his body pressed against mine. It didn't change the way my own body was responding, with a deep, resonant hum of rightness, a feeling of coming home to a place I had never been allowed to visit. A profound sadness settled over me, mingling with the hope and the fear. I was living a borrowed dream. I was a stand-in, a temporary comfort, a placeholder for the warmth he was missing in his life. He wasn't choosing me, Julian. He was choosing the idea of not being alone. And when the morning came, he would wake up, stretch, and move away, and the magic of the moment would dissipate like mist. He would probably make a joke about it, about how he must have been colder than he thought, and I would have to laugh along, pretending it meant nothing to me either. I would have to swallow the truth, that for those few hours in the dark, I had felt more whole, more real, than I had in years. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft sound of his breathing. The movie had ended long ago, the screen now a blank, black mirror reflecting the dim light of the room. I looked at our reflection, two indistinct shapes melded together on the couch. From a distance, we could have been lovers, settled in for a quiet night. It was a cruel illusion, a trick of the light. I very carefully, very slowly, relaxed my body, letting myself lean into his weight, accepting the fragile gift of his closeness. I rested my cheek against the top of his head, his hair soft and cool against my skin. It was a bold move, even for my own private thoughts, but I couldn't resist. Just for a moment, I allowed myself the fantasy. I closed my eyes and imagined a world where this was not an accident, where this was our normal, our everyday. A world where I was allowed to hold him, to comfort him, not as a friend, but as something more. The thought was so beautiful, so painful, that a single, hot tear escaped and traced a silent path down my temple. The door to my guest room had become a symbol, a silent character in our nightly drama. It was a simple, white-painted door, but it held a universe of meaning. When Liam first started staying over, I had offered him the room, of course. It had a comfortable bed, clean sheets, a semblance of privacy. He had used it the first few nights, closing the door firmly behind him. I would lie awake in my own room, separated by a wall, hyper-aware of his presence in my apartment, of the small sounds of him settling in for the night. But then, as his couch sleeping became the norm, the guest room door remained perpetually open, the room itself unused, a silent testament to the shift in our dynamic. I started thinking of it as the door of plausible deniability. As long as that door was open, as long as the option of a separate bed existed, his choice to fall asleep next to me on the couch could be framed as an accident born of exhaustion. He wasn't choosing to share a space with me in an intimate way. He was simply too tired to make it the extra 20 feet to the bedroom. It was a fiction we both implicitly agreed to uphold. He never mentioned the empty bed, and I never pushed him towards it. The open door allowed us to exist in this ambiguous space without having to confront what it might mean. Closing it would have felt like an admission, a definitive statement. Leaving it open was a question mark, and I had become more comfortable living inside that question than I was with risking an answer I didn't want to hear. The night of the blanket, the night he had curled up against me, had changed something. The following evening, he arrived looking less tired but more thoughtful. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze that I hadn't seen before. We went through our usual ritual, takeout, a movie, but the air between us felt different. It was charged, heavy with the unspoken memory of the previous night. I was acutely aware of the space between us on the couch, a gulf that felt both enormous and easily crossed. He didn't fall asleep. We watched the entire movie, and when the credits rolled, he turned to me, the blue light of the screen illuminating the seriousness in his eyes. "Jules," he began, his voice low. "Can I ask you something?" My heart stuttered. Of course, he hesitated, searching for the right words. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I knew well. "Last night, I was really out of it. Was I? I don't know, crowding you or something. I just feel like I've been crashing here, taking over your space. I don't want to be a burden. It was the out I had been expecting, the casual dismissal I had steeled myself for. This was my cue to laugh it off, to say, "Don't be ridiculous, it's fine." It was the script I had rehearsed in my head. But looking at his face, at the genuine concern in his eyes, I found I couldn't say the lines. The lie felt too heavy, too dishonest. I took a breath. "You're never a burden, Liam." My voice was steadier than I felt. "And no, you weren't crowding me. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. It was a carefully chosen slice of the truth, the safest part." He seemed to relax, but only slightly. He kept looking at me, his gaze unwavering. "Okay," he said, drawing the word out. "Okay." Good, he didn't look away. The silence stretched, filled with a new kind of tension. It wasn't the anxious hum of my own secret feelings anymore. It felt shared. It was a tangible thing, a pressure building in the space between us. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind at my back, with the choice to either step back to safety or leap into the unknown. And then, he closed the distance. He moved slowly, deliberately, shifting on the cushion until our knees were touching, until his shoulder was pressed against mine. He looked down at our hands, resting just inches apart on the sofa. I followed his gaze, my own hands suddenly feeling huge and clumsy. I could see the slight tremor in his fingers. He was nervous. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He, Liam, the sun god of easy confidence, was nervous. He lifted his eyes back to mine. His expression was open, vulnerable, stripped of all its usual defenses. It was the face of the man who had slept on my shoulder, not the man who charmed rooms and conquered swimming pools. "Julian," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. It all faded away into a dull, muffled roar. The only thing that was real was his question, hanging in the air between us. It was not a proposition, not a move. It was a plea. It was a question that held all of his fear and uncertainty, and it was a gift. He was giving me the power, the choice. He was laying his own vulnerability at my feet, asking for permission to enter a space that I had only ever dreamed of. My own fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. 1,000 voices screamed in my head. "This is a mistake. He's rebounding. He's confused. You'll ruin everything." The foundation of our friendship, the one constant in my life, was trembling on the brink of collapse. Saying yes could destroy the most important thing I had. But saying no felt like a betrayal of a deeper truth. It felt like turning my back on the one thing I had wanted for more than a decade. It felt like locking a door and throwing away the key, condemning myself to a lifetime in the lonely room of my own caution. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the friend who had defended me against a locker room bully in our freshman year. I saw the man who had sat with me for 6 hours in an emergency room after I broke my wrist. I saw the person who knew, without me saying a word, when I needed to be left alone and when I needed someone to just sit with me in the quiet. And I saw the man in front of me now, his heart in his eyes, waiting for my answer. I couldn't find my voice. The words were trapped somewhere in my throat. So I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. His relief was a visible thing, a wave that washed over his face, softening his features. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to change my mind. His eyes never left mine until the very last second. And then his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of passion or fire. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was tentative, soft, a question in itself. It was gentle and achingly tender. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft. It tasted of salt and coffee and a decade of unspoken longing. I felt the tremor in his hand as he brought it up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. It was a gesture of such profound care that it broke something open inside me. All the walls I had built, all the defenses I had perfected, they just crumbled into dust. I kissed him back, a mirror of his own gentleness. I brought my own hand up to cover his, holding it against my face. It wasn't about desire, not in that moment. It was about recognition. It was about seeing and being seen. It was the end of a long, lonely silence. It was the answer to a question I had been too afraid to even ask. The kiss ended as softly as it had begun. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were dark, searching. "Okay," he whispered, his breath warm against my lips. "Okay," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. It was more than okay. It was everything. It was the earthquake that brings down the old, unsafe structures to make way for something new to be built in their place. It was terrifying and beautiful, and, in a way I couldn't yet comprehend, it felt like coming home. The aftermath was a landscape of tender, terrifying silence. We didn't talk about it. We didn't define it. We simply existed in the new reality the kiss had created. He stayed the night, but for the first time, he didn't sleep on the couch. After a long, charged moment of hesitation at the threshold of the hallway, I had gestured towards my bedroom, a silent invitation. He had followed, and we had slept in my bed, not touching, a careful foot of space between us like a buffer zone, as if the intimacy of the kiss had been so overwhelming that we now needed to retreat to our own sides. But the air was thick with it. I was so aware of him, of his breathing in the dark, of the warmth of his body across the small distance, that I barely slept. It was a night of suspended animation, a breath held in anticipation of what would come next. The next morning was painfully, excruciatingly normal. He made coffee while I showered. We talked about the weather. He left for work with a casual "see you later" and a brief, almost shy, touch to my arm. The chasm between the monumental event of the kiss and the mundane routine of the morning was disorienting. I felt like I was walking on a different planet, one where the laws of physics had subtly changed overnight. I spent the day in a daze, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it from every angle, like a photograph I was trying to develop, searching for hidden details in the shadows. Was it real? Did it mean what I thought it meant? And then, he disappeared. It started subtly. A text that evening saying he had to work late. Rain check. It said, the question mark feeling less like a query and more like a wall. The next day, another text. He was grabbing dinner with some work friends. The day after that, silence. My calls went to voicemail. My texts were met with short, delayed responses that said nothing. Busy, tired, talk later. The space he had so completely occupied in my life, in my apartment, was suddenly, violently empty. The silence in my living room was no longer peaceful. It was a screaming void. The couch looked huge and desolate. The guest room door, still ajar, seemed to mock me. A cold, familiar dread began to seep into my bones. I had been right. It was a mistake. He was regretting it. He was panicking. I had taken his moment of vulnerable, post-breakup confusion, and I had let myself believe it was something more. I had been a fool. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest withered and died, leaving behind a bitter, toxic ash. The ache returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the dull, chronic pain of quiet longing. It was the sharp, acute agony of loss. I had been given a glimpse of a world I desperately wanted to live in, only to have the door slammed shut in my face. The anger came next, a slow, simmering rage directed mostly at myself. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have misread the situation so completely? I had risked the most important friendship of my life for a moment of weakness, for a fantasy. I tried to hate him. I really did. I tried to focus on the cruelty of his silence, the cowardice of his retreat. I told myself he was selfish, that he had used me for comfort and then discarded me when things got too real. I tried to build a wall of anger around my heart, to protect it from the hurt. But it was impossible. Every corner of my apartment was haunted by him. The woolen blanket was still draped over the armchair. His favorite mug was in the dish rack. I'd turn on the radio in my studio, and every song, every single stupid love song about heartbreak or longing, felt like it was written about us. A lyric about a quiet night, a line about a secret love, they were all tiny, sharp needles pricking at the raw wound of his absence. My life, which had been so full of his presence just days before, now felt impossibly empty. The foundation hadn't just been fractured, it had been shattered. I was left standing in the rubble, alone. After a week of this agonizing silence, a week of me spiraling deeper and deeper into a well of misery and self-recrimination, I knew I couldn't let it end this way. Our friendship, the decade of history we shared, deserved more than a ghosting. It deserved an explanation. Even if the explanation was, I made a huge mistake and I don't feel that way about you. I needed to hear it. The ambiguity was killing me, a slow poison of maybes and what-ifs. I needed the finality of a closed door, even if it was a door I never wanted to see closed. I drove to his apartment. It was late, after 10 at night. I hadn't called, hadn't texted. I knew if I gave him the chance, he would just make another excuse. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart pounding in my chest, my hand hovering over the buzzer. This was it. This was the conversation that would either salvage some wreckage of our friendship or burn the whole thing to the ground. I finally pressed the button, the buzz echoing in the quiet hallway like an alarm. It took him a long time to answer. I was just about to turn away, to give up, when I heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding back. The door opened a few inches, and he peered out. He looked awful. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked like I felt. When he saw it was me, his face crumpled. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was a complicated mess of guilt and relief and despair. "Jules," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk, Liam," I said, my own voice tight, trying to keep the tremor out of it. "You can't just disappear." He didn't argue. He just opened the door wider and stepped back, letting me in. His apartment was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over the furniture. It was the apartment of a man who was falling apart. He closed the door behind me, the click of the lock sounding unnervingly final. He wouldn't look at me. He just stood there, his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking on the word. "I'm so sorry, Julian. I'm such a coward." The anger I had been nursing, the protective shell I had built, it just dissolved when I heard the raw pain in his voice. All I was left with was the hurt. "Why, Liam?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Just tell me why. If it was a mistake, just say it. I can take it. But the silence. The silence is what's destroying me." He finally turned to face me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Because it wasn't a mistake," he said, and the words seemed to be torn out of him. "That's the problem. It wasn't a mistake, and it terrified me." He sank down onto his sofa, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Jules. Everything is so confusing. After Sarah left, I was just lost. And you were there. You were just so solid, so good. And I started to lean on you. And it felt better than just leaning. It felt right. Being with you, on your couch. It was the only time in months that I felt safe, peaceful." He looked up at me, his face a mask of anguish. "And then I kissed you. And it was the most real thing I've felt in years. It wasn't about Sarah. It wasn't about being lonely. It was about you. It was about wanting to kiss you. And the second it was over, I just panicked. What does this mean? Who am I? I just broke up with the woman I thought I was going to marry, and now this." It felt like my whole world, my whole idea of myself, was just tilting on its axis. I felt like I was going crazy. He took a shaky breath. "So I ran. I thought if I just put some distance between us, I could figure it out, get my head straight. But it just made it worse. Everything felt wrong without you. My apartment felt wrong. My own head felt wrong. It's like, you're the only thing that makes sense right now, and that's what's scaring me the most." I stood there, listening to his confession, and I felt the tectonic plates of my own world shifting, realigning. All my assumptions, all my carefully constructed narratives of his rejection, they were all wrong. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was just as lost and terrified as I was. I crossed the room and sat down next to him on the couch. It was his couch, his messy apartment, but the dynamic was the same. I was the quiet, steady presence. He was the one in turmoil. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just sat with him in his confusion, in his fear. I let his words settle in the space between us. Finally, I spoke, my voice soft. You don't have to have it all figured out. Liam, he looked at me, his eyes wide and vulnerable. You think I have it figured out? I asked, a small, wry smile touching my lips. I've been in love with you for 10 years. For a solid decade. I have been terrified of you finding out and ruining the best friendship I've ever had. For the past 3 months, I've been sitting on my couch, with you next to me, feeling like I was going to spontaneously combust from wanting to touch you. And when you kissed me, I was sure my heart was going to stop. So no, I don't have anything figured out. I'm just as scared as you are. The look on his face as I said the words, I've been in love with you for 10 years, was something I would photograph in my mind and keep forever. It was a look of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a slow, dawning wonder. It was like he was seeing me for the first time, not as a fixture in his life, but as a person with a hidden world of their own. 10 years, he whispered, his voice full of awe. I nodded, the confession making me feel both incredibly vulnerable and impossibly light. Since the conference championships our sophomore year, you won the 200-meter freestyle. You got out of the pool, and you smiled, and yeah, that was it for me. A slow smile spread across his face, a real smile, the first one I had seen in what felt like a lifetime. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. He shook his head, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping him. All this time, he said, more to himself than to me. All this time you were right there. He reached out, his hand covering mine where it rested on the cushion between us. His touch was no longer hesitant or accidental. It was firm, intentional. A statement. I'm an idiot, he said softly, his eyes searching mine. I've been such an idiot. I'm so sorry I ran. I'm sorry I hurt you. I was hurt, I admitted. But I think I understand. Can we just start from here? He asked, his voice pleading. From this moment, no more running. No more pretending. Just this. Us. Trying to figure it out. Together, I repeated, the word feeling solid and real in my mouth. I squeezed his hand. Okay. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sigh of profound relief that seemed to empty him of all the tension and fear he'd been carrying. He leaned his head against my shoulder, a gesture that was no longer ambiguous, no longer born of exhaustion. It was a choice. It was a declaration. It was home. And I leaned my head against his, closing my eyes, feeling the broken pieces of my world start to slot back into place, not in the old configuration, but into a new shape, a new foundation that was stronger and more honest than anything I had known before. We just sat there for a long time, in the quiet of his messy apartment, holding hands, two lost and frightened people who had finally found their way to the same place at the same time. The days that followed were a process of careful reconstruction. We didn't fall into a whirlwind romance. It was quieter than that, more deliberate. It felt like we were learning a new language together, a language of intentional touch and spoken feelings, where before we had only communicated through subtext and assumption. The grand, terrifying unknowns were broken down into smaller, manageable moments. A hand held while walking down the street. A kiss goodbye at my apartment door that lingered a little longer each time. Long talks late into the night, not about his old grief or my old longing, but about us, about the future, about what we wanted this new thing between us to be. He still slept at my place most nights, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The couch became just a couch again. My bed became our bed. The first night after our conversation, after we had laid all our cards on the table, there was no empty space between us. He had turned to me in the dark and simply said, "Can I hold you?" And I had gone into his arms without a second of hesitation. Being held by him, really held, with intention and care, was a revelation. It was a feeling of such profound safety, of such rightness, that it silenced all the anxious voices in my head. It was the physical manifestation of the emotional sanctuary we had been building for years without ever realizing it. His body was a warm, solid presence against mine, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against my back. That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply, dreamlessly, anchored by his weight. We had to navigate the small, practical architecture of merging two lives that had run on parallel tracks for so long. He brought a toothbrush to leave in my bathroom, a small, domestic act that felt monumental. I cleared a drawer for him in my dresser. He helped me clean out my darkroom one Saturday, listening with that old, genuine interest as I explained the chemical processes, the magic of watching an image emerge from nothing on a blank sheet of paper. "It's kind of like us, isn't it?" he had said, looking at a photo of a winter landscape slowly appearing in the developing tray. Something was there all along, in the negative. It just needed the right conditions to finally be seen. His capacity for quiet poetry still took my breath away. There were moments of fear, of course. Old habits and insecurities don't vanish overnight. I would sometimes catch myself analyzing his moods, searching for signs of regret or withdrawal. A quiet spell from him could send a flicker of my old panic through me. And he had his own ghosts to contend with, moments where the sheer newness of his feelings for me would make him pensive and distant. But the difference now was that we talked about it. Instead of letting the silence fester, one of us would reach out. "You seem far away," I'd say. "What are you thinking?" And he would tell me. He would voice his fears, his confusion, and I would just listen, and then I would tell him mine. We were building our foundation not on silent assumptions, but on the sturdy, reliable bedrock of honesty. One evening, about a month after what we had started calling the conversation, he came over and found me staring at the guest room door. I had been thinking about how it had been the symbol of our unspoken contract, of our shared denial. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "What's on your mind?" he asked softly. "This door," I said. "I was just thinking about this door, about how it was always open." He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel him understanding my meaning. He squeezed me gently. Then he let go, walked over to the door, and pushed it shut. The click of the latch was soft, but it echoed in the apartment like a gavel. It was a simple, definitive act, an ending and a beginning. He turned back to me, a small, confident smile on his face. "Problem solved," he said. It was such a small thing, but it felt huge. It was the closing of a chapter. The guest room was just a guest room again, ready for some hypothetical visitor in the future. It was no longer a part of our story. Our story was happening here, in the living room, in the kitchen, in our bedroom. We were no longer living in the question mark. We were starting to build the answer. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had defined us before. It was not a silence of unspoken feelings or anxious tension. It was a silence of comfort, of complete and total ease. It was the silence of two people reading in the same room, the silence of a shared glance across a dinner table, the silence of waking up in the middle of the night and just listening to the other person breathe. We had spent so long trying to interpret the spaces between the words, and now we had discovered that the most profound communication happened when no words were needed at all. We had found our way out of the shadows of ambiguity and into the soft, steady light of a shared morning. The foundation wasn't just repaired. It was entirely new, built not on the quiet stone of one man's secret love, but on the joined hands of two people who had been brave enough to choose each other, to build a home in the shelter of that choice, and to finally close the door.